One of my favorite parts of Genshin Impact's combat system is teams and character synergy. With 60 unique characters and counting, experimenting with different combinations can be one of the most satisfying parts of the game to explore. So, let's talk about teams. We'll explore the most common character roles and why roles alone are not enough, and touch on what people mean by synergy and why it's important. We'll then outline a way to visualize team rotations, which will help you understand popular team archetypes and why they work, and start to create your own original teams. Character roles can be mostly thought of as falling into two major categories, DPS and support. DPS means damage per second. A DPS character is one whose intended purpose is to attack and cause damage to your enemies. There are really only three roles in the DPS category: sub-DPS, main DPS and hypercarry. A sub-DPS is a character who causes a lot of damage while they are not actively on the field. You'll switch to them for a short time, attack, and then quickly switch to another character. They do a lot of damage, but they aren't the focus of your attention. In contrast, a character who fills the main DPS role will be the focal point of your team. You will keep this character actively on the field much longer, attacking and causing chaos, while swapping to your other characters for brief time periods. A hypercarry is a main DPS taken to the extreme. You set up any buffs from supporting characters, then switch to the hypercarry character. Once you start attacking, you almost never stop until their attack sequence is finished. A support character is any whose main purpose in your team is something other than causing damage. The five most common roles are Enabler, Healer, Shielder, Battery, and Crowd Controller. An Enabler is a character who either provides buffs to your other characters or applies their abilities to set up elemental reactions for your DPS characters to execute. A Healer is a character who heals your party. A Shielder is someone who creates an elemental shield which protects your characters from taking damage. A Battery is someone whose abilities generate a lot of energy particles, allowing your characters to use their bursts more consistently. Finally, crowd control characters physically move enemies, sometimes by pushing them around, but often by sucking them all into one spot, which can greatly increase how effective your team is in combat. However, just looking at a list of roles is not enough. Most characters fulfill multiple roles at the same time. Kokomi is an incredible healer who also enables reactions by applying lots of hydro to enemies. Diona provides both healing and shielding. Sometimes a character fulfills extra roles once you have unlocked a specific constellation. For example, Beidou C1 unlocks her shield ability. Some weapons and artifact sets also enable characters to fulfill roles which aren't built into their talents. The Favonius weapons turn any character into a good battery, while the Noblesse Oblige artifact set turns a character into an attack boosting enabler. Sometimes you'll use these weapons and sets to improve an already strong character, while other times you'll use them to bring something completely new to the team. Bennett is often used with the Noblesse artifact set, which doubles down on his existing attack boost. Meanwhile, Yanfei is sometimes used with Noblesse to change her from main DPS to more of a support, alongside other changes explored in my previous video in this series. It's also important to note that a character's equipment constitutes an overwhelming majority of their strength, and as a result, you can build any character as a viable DPS if you're determined enough. So, now that we've covered the roles characters fulfill, what is synergy? Synergy means how well a set of characters work together. Characters who complement one another have good synergy. They amplify each other's strengths, cover for each other's weaknesses, and generally make for a lot more powerful team. Characters with bad synergy work together badly or not at all. Sometimes this is because they're intended to fulfill the same role, but there can be more subtle reasons too. For example, teams which contain elements which do not interact with one another, like Geo and Dendro, are often at a disadvantage. While reactions are a good first thing to look at when looking to build a team with good synergy, it's also important to consider the other aspects of your character as well. For example, Layla's skill is mostly useful for her shield, but it also shoots out some cryo at times. This can be very useful for reactions. It does this once it has collected 4 of these stars, which generate every 1.5 seconds, which means she applies cryo every 6 seconds by default. An extra star is also generated when a character inside her shield uses their skill. This means that if you put Layla in a team with other characters who have a shorter skill cooldown, she will provide more cryo than she would normally. Even better, some characters have a skill you can use multiple times, which means even more cryo. For example, using Yamiko's skill 3 times instantly triggers Layla's cryo application. This kind of interaction between characters is a subtle part of Genshin team synergy, but it can make a big difference. Another detail to be aware of is that some characters have abilities that just do not work together. For example, it might seem like Yelan and Zhao would work well together. Yelan provides a lot of off-field damage, while Zhao works as a hypercarry main DPS who wants to spend a lot of time attacking. Normally, these two character roles fit perfectly together. However, Yelan's off-field damage can only be triggered by normal attacks. It is not triggered by skills, bursts, or plunging attacks. Zhao's intended playstyle focuses on his plunging attacks, so when these two characters are played together, Yelan often does no off-field damage at all. Another important aspect of team synergy is the concept of smooth rotation. A rotation is the order in which you swap between your characters and use their abilities. A smooth rotation is one which feels natural to you. Arguably, the biggest factor which determines the smoothness of a team's rotation is the cooldowns on characters' abilities. A team with well-optimized rotation will line everything up so that by the time you switch to a character, their cooldown will have just ended and you're perfectly timed to use it quickly and switch to the next person. This is often the difference between a team which feels mostly okay and a team which feels just right. Many viable teams have awkward rotations, which often leaves you waiting for a couple of seconds after switching to a character before their cooldown ends. It can trip you up, but it's not the end of the world. However, a team with a smooth rotation just feels special. There's nothing quite like the feeling when the end of one rotation lines up perfectly with the start of the next one, and even the toughest enemies just disappear. I tend to think about teams using a visual framework, reminiscent of rhythm games. In my head, each of the 4 character slots is represented by a line, and each action is a circle on that character's line. As time passes, I press each button when the timer reaches that circle. It's also useful when thinking about which actions will take place while a specific buff is active, or what can be fit in before a specific cooldown ends. This type of diagram makes it really easy to see the difference between the common team archetypes. Note that the following clips are not perfect rotations or perfectly built characters, they are just a guide to show roughly what I have in mind. A basic team with one main DPS character involves some setup followed by attacking with the main character with a quick cycle time and occasional character swapping throughout. A team built around a hypercarry character has a quick rotation through supports and then a much longer time with the DPS character. This is usually a much more rigid rotation than other teams. A team with a non-DPS character used as a reaction driver, such as electrocharged or soup teams, looks fairly similar to a more typical DPS team, though these are usually even more flexible and open to deviations from the intended rotation. A quick swap team is noticeably different since it has no main focus or driver, with a rapid switching between all the characters and a strong focus on skills and bursts. This can be chaotic but can almost feel expressive when you tweak your rotation to match the situation at hand. These diagrams can also make it really obvious when characters won't work well together. For example, 2 hypercarries in one team is a bad idea. Often, if you switch away, their self-provided buffs disappear, so you aim to keep them on field for the entire duration. The rest of the team setup is designed to maximize the damage of the main DPS by stacking multiple buffs for the duration of their attack sequence. Having 2 hypercarries would mean that you have 1 less support character, but get no advantage in return, since you cannot switch between the 2 hypercarries. It's very much a waste. However, not all main DPS characters are quite as selfish as these hypercarry characters. If you look at Ganyu Melt and Ayato Vate teams, you might assume that since they both work well as the focus of the team, they would not fit well together. In reality, they can actually be brilliant as a rare team with 2 main DPS characters. They take turns to use their burst and swap out, providing off-field elemental application, while the other character attacks in a surprisingly smooth for each team rotation. Throw in an Anemo character for swirl and a shielder for extra defense, and this is actually a very comfortable team with a very smooth rotation, though it's a little underpowered and best used in the overworld instead of the abyss. This mental model can also come in handy when analyzing your team to see whether you can make small tweaks to provide more damage. For example, this team called Raiden Sunfire felt quite natural at first by following this rotation, with Raiden's skill followed by burst from Bennett, Xingqiu, then Jean, before finishing off with Raiden's burst. The idea with this rotation is that Bennett's burst would buff everyone else's burst and Jean would swirl whatever happened to be available. However, this is actually not ideal. Raiden actually provides the majority of the damage, so we would ideally want Jean to swirl Electro only, so Jean should go second in the rotation. Also, Xingqiu's burst does not snapshot when cast, and the damage of each round of his Hydro Swords is calculated at the moment they shoot out, so he can go before Bennett without losing his benefit of Bennett's buffs. By putting Bennett last, a greater proportion of Raiden's burst benefits from his attack buff. This slightly altered team rotation feels almost exactly the same as the original one, but the buffs and abilities combine better better, and the result is quite shocking. In a few test runs, the original rotation completed this chamber in around 1 minute 45 seconds, while the adjusted rotation completed it in about 1 minute 20 seconds. That's a 20% reduction. It's not quite as simple as just lining up the cooldowns, however, since other factors can be more important. Take this Ayaka freeze rotation for example. At first glance, we might aim for Shenhe's buff to cover as much of Ayaka's field time as possible. A natural looking rotation would be to use Kokomi first, then Kazuha, then Shenhe, then Ayaka. But this actually doesn't quite work right. We lose out on most of Kazuha's strength because he starts off by swirling Hydro, so we don't reduce the enemy's resistance to Cryo. Instead, we get better results by swapping Shenhe and Kazuha around. Shenhe's buff has less of an overlap with Ayaka's attacks, but we get the full power of Kazuha's buffs, which makes a huge difference. We also gain enough time that we can use Shenhe's skill twice in a rotation, greatly increasing Ayaka's damage for a much better result. Another interesting thing to consider is how you can adjust your teams to target specific enemies and their weaknesses. A while ago, I was testing the Raiden Sunfire team on the Abyss Floor 12, but was struggling to defeat Chamber 3 quickly enough. The Angry Triangle robot turns invisible, and you're supposed to use certain reactions to make it visible again, but the team was not able to do any of those reactions needed. The robot's invisibility breaks instantly if you hit it with a Dendro reaction, so I decided to try adding a Dendro character to the team. Nahida can function surprisingly well in place of Bennett. The rotation remains the same, but the source of the team's damage changes quite a bit. With Bennett in the team, it focuses mostly on raw attack damage, but with Nahida, it's more of a mix of different types of reactions. This team was equally strong on the earlier chambers of Abyss Floor 12, and made the final floor an absolute breeze due to having the right elements to take advantage of the enemy's weakness. If you're unsure of yourself but want to start trying out new teams, I'd recommend first understanding these general team templates, and then looking at some popular recommended teams to see how they actually put them into practice. You can then start by thinking about what effect swapping out one of the characters for a different one would have. You compare the talents and use patterns of the characters you're swapping, and adjust the team's rotation to take the differences into account. Then test it out and see if you got it right, or if there's things you didn't consider. And if all else fails, pick the characters you like and experiment with them until you find teams that feel good to you.